The purpose of our activity is for us knowing about all the matters about the architectural barriers existing in our society, and all the activities within this project will be aimed at reduction or elimination of such barriers as possible. We will be working with the bodies of local governance and central government, as well as organization, as well as with non-governmental organization, is holding of working groups to know how we better take into account the needs of the people with disabilities during the rebuilding of Ukraine. And I would like to start with the example that we faced yesterday. We were picking a place for dinner in the city of Kiev, and we've understood that we cannot pick a place we wanted to go to, but we had to attend to one of the small number of venues where people moving in the wheelchairs may visit. What it means actually, that if a person is injured, they don't want to go to visit cinemas or theaters, walk along the parks with the friends, or go to a dinner with their friends. No, it's not true. When people get disabled, first of all, they remain people, and disability does not characterize them in no way. The League of the Strong, during their activity as organization, analyzes the legislation and practice of the processes going on in Ukraine in terms of attitude to people with disabilities. And we have example that the legislators, when they submit the draft laws, they contemplate the standards which improve the architecture of the buildings, but at the same way they word the legislation in a way that lets the developers avoid those standards. And we also analyzed the module towns. Why did we research that subject? Because during evacuation of people with disabilities, the question of residence is most sensitive, because finding place for people with disabilities is extremely difficult, and model towns are a response to how to temporarily provide a residence for people who flee from the war. But the majority of such model cities are not contemplated for people who move with the wheelchairs, or who have problems with the sight, who are blind, and for those who need private space for servicing their needs. We analyzed 25 model towns, and the majority of them, well, the 25 towns, including 12 plus 12 which are being constructed, and 30 which are planned to be installed, they account for 8,500 residents in total, and 30,000 more are planned to become residents. So those model towns are a way to provide people with dwelling in a prompt manner, but they don't take into account the needs of the people with disabilities. So we've taken as a basis the regulations for renewal after the reconstruction after the disasters, and the model towns that we studied, they don't comply with those standards. The bathrooms are not accessible, so the people with disabilities are actually incapable of living in such places. Why I'm talking about the model towns when we talk about the rebuilding of Ukraine? Because it's the example of how the system may operate. Many players, including international partners and Ukrainian organizations, international donors, business organizations, who are and bodies of local governance and central government, are all involved in construction of such model towns. And our task is make sure this mechanism works, and all of the components, they know what is universal design and what is accessibility, and inclusiveness, and we defined a number of areas what can be done, a number of guidelines, and actually there's a lot more of them, but time is limited and I would like to stop at a number of them. We have to increase the responsibility and liability for non-compliance with the standards, and we have to provide the mechanism to make sure that they are comply with the standards of inclusiveness. We have to implement the indicators of architectural accessibility to communicate the standards of universal design to the bodies of local governance, because a lot of results will depend on them. And during planning, we have to include the non-governmental organizations which deal with the matters of disability, and we will be happy to share all our work and the ideas we have. Thank you for this information, Daria. I just want to add that I am an internally displaced person. I use a wheelchair together with my husband, and we were not able to find a shelter. We were fleeing from Bucha, and I know a lot of people who were forced to live abroad without wishing actually to leave Ukraine, and it was only due to the absence of accessibility. So it's about real stories, about real people who are injured and they are forced to move to the West because they don't have proper conditions of living here in Ukraine. Well, you know, today is the 8th of March, the day that reminds us of the rights of women. It's not holiday in Ukraine, it's still a day off, but today it's my pleasure to see the women who are decision makers, and I want to pass the microphone to one of those women, Ms. Oksana Zhelnovich, the Minister of Social Policies. Thank you for this opportunity to get involved in this conversation. The rights of people with disabilities, as in view of this full-scale invasion, are becoming a very hot topic. The subjects you've brought up are critical, and now that today we're talking about the rights of women who are mostly insured, but talking about the way that women had to go to be able to put their pants on or a suit on to get a job they want, to take the positions, the offices they want, to just to vote, to study. That was a long way of struggle, fights, contradictions, and that was the energies, the strength of the women who never gave up, who were not relying on circumstances, on their destiny, but they were changing the rules. And now when we talk about the rights of people with disabilities, we create the communities that should not rely on the circumstances. They should not stand aside. They should create a community and create a new agenda, so that people with disabilities who sit in a wheelchair could be normal in any restaurant or any public space, so that nobody even thinks about designing a public space without without taking into account the needs of all the people, because any one of us may get disabled to a certain extent at any moment. For example, my knee hurts and I know what it feels like to go up and down the stairs. So designing the spaces available and accessible to everybody, we facilitate the lives for people that we know and maybe for us ourselves in future. So today I would like to mention other aspects of the policies, maybe social policies, not only infrastructure policy, but what we also plan or how we see the removal of barriers in rehabilitation, for example in private rehabilitation, because unfortunately until today treatment and rehabilitation and support with the additional supplies was scattered in time and structure and space. People had to switch from one phase to another through all those circles of hell, and it was terrible. Now we see it in videos, and this is not how it's supposed to be. So in cooperation with the Ministry of Health, we start the project for rehabilitation in the healthcare facilities, and work of all those social workers in healthcare facilities, so that people don't have to go through internet, through their friends, through some non-official channels to find proper information they need, but they can obtain that information to the maximum professional extent possible. And for the people who were injured, we should give them the opportunity to get socialized promptly, not like after a year when those people receive everything they need that is contemplated actually by the law, when they can adapt. So the first step is the rapid rehabilitation. It's the number one priority. I know that many people who are disabled, they take this transformation with caution because they are afraid their rights will be limited. But no, we remember about that, and we will talk with our colleagues and the communities about how to segregate that part of rights. What is social rehabilitation? Because rehabilitation can be difficult. It should be systemic, just like in the system of healthcare we rely on our family doctors because they know the condition of the health of their families, and this is how we should make sure that all those social services provided to the people who are disabled, so they're included in the society to the maximum extent in compliance with the modern challenges that we have now. So I rely too much to big large extent here on non-governmental organizations. They are flexible, they tried a lot in their life, and us as a government, we have to pick up that experience. So our next block that we will be dealing with is development of social services, specifically those social services which are very hot topics today. It's social accompaniment, social rehabilitation for all the people with disabilities, specifically those who get disabled due to the war and their relatives. And another thing I would like to focus our attention on is the support of employment for people with disabilities. I'm convinced that every person should be economically independent. We should not provide subsidies or preferences. Everyone should be able to make something for themselves to the extent comfortable for their lives, and those people, we should only provide the conditions for them, the inclusive non-barrier access to the workspace, to the jobs, and we support this project of employment for new jobs, and we want to implement the new formats for such support. And we should make sure the employers and employees are friends, and there are many businesses now that support people with disabilities, but the legislation is such that the organizations, the businesses like those cannot get any governmental support. But I want any business who employ people with disabilities to this or that extent would be able to receive some government support, and that we encourage those activities, because social businesses are a part of our society that should be properly recognized, they should be properly respected. And in my ideal world, any business should have a social component. So this is when we will live comfortably with no barriers, and we will have no this positive discrimination. But we are at the stage where this positive discrimination is absolutely necessary. So we will work on the number of measures which would allow our people with disabilities to get back to the jobs market, not at minimal wage but with a decent wage, which would correspond to all the professional skills that those people have, which is very important for the general removal of barriers and accessibility and inclusiveness. Thank you, Ms. Oksana. The purpose of all the rehabilitations is to get people back to their normal lives, and it's my pleasure to introduce Catherine Knighton, Director for European Disabilities Forum, and I would like to pass the microphone to her. Well, I want to thank you for this opportunity for you to get here in Ukraine. Thank you.
And thank you very much to League of Strong for the invitation to be here for this discussion. It's really my honor to be here and to listen to you all and to hear about the current situation in Ukraine. So my organization, the European Disability Forum, is a network of organizations of persons with disabilities in Europe. And we count amongst our members the League of Strong and the National Assembly of Persons with Disabilities. So we're very happy to have this connection with the disability movement here in Ukraine. We did not have before last year, so our cooperation is just building up during this time. There's a very strong support for us to work in Ukraine from the organizations of people with disabilities right across Europe, and I bring my greetings from them. I wanted to just say that our hope is to continue to work and support the organizations in Ukraine in the future, and I'm here to listen and to hear how things are going and to see what the priorities are right now. We were initially contacted by the National Assembly of Persons with Disabilities all the way back in February, and since then we realized at the beginning that the disability movement in Ukraine, all across the country, organizations were helping people with disabilities with evacuation, helping people move to other countries, providing information, providing shelter and humanitarian assistance. At the same time, organizations of people with disabilities in the countries bordering Ukraine, in Romania, Slovakia, in Poland, in Latvia and Lithuania, and then across Europe, we're trying to provide support also to people with disabilities arriving in their countries. In some cases, it was, that services are also not perfect in European countries. So the challenges that you have in Ukraine, like accommodation and transport, these also exist in other places. But the organizations try to provide support, information in Ukrainian, direct advice to people. And so we intend to continue to collaborate in the long term and hope eventually to be working together with Ukrainian organizations as full members of the European Union in the future. Is there anything else? Do you want me to talk anything about the reconstruction process? Is now a good moment? Yeah, so since the discussion today is about reconstruction, this is something that's a really important moment for accessibility. As you know, it is way more efficient to make something accessible when you build it for the first time. But as Daria mentioned, with the provision of shelter, still today, people plan buildings that are not accessible, and then it takes years to fix them. So it's great that you have this commitment at the moment and you're already doing advocacy to make sure that this first building and planning is fully accessible. Eventually, as Ukraine is joining the European Union, there will have to anyway be alignment with many laws like the European Accessibility Act, Public Procurement Directive. So it is better already now to consider these standards and policies in reconstruction. I was asked to say if there were countries nearby which have good examples, and there are many countries which are developing accessibility a lot. Your neighbouring country, Poland, for example, have done a lot of work at making their own new accessibility law. They have an accessibility council which includes a range of experts, academics, architects, NGOs, 15 disabled persons organization, independent experts who are people with disabilities who advise the government. It's managed by the Ministry for Regional Development and Funding, so they use a lot of European funds for this. But this consultative body, which is very multi-sectoral, is an ongoing support to policy development, because in many countries the legislation is good but the implementation is not there. And so it's incredibly important to have this constant attention to implementation and enforcement of the laws. One final thing I wanted to say is that we have been, we were lucky enough at the beginning when we started to work with the organizations in Ukraine and the neighboring countries, is we had funding provided from CBM International. We have a representative here today, Jaime, who's also come to look at the work that's being done. So we were able to help the organizations with funding. It's really clear that civil society organizations in Ukraine are extremely active, and they have been providing assistance without very much support, but we hope that they will eventually be able to have enough support and funding to run. When we spoke with people with disabilities and their families who've left Ukraine and asked them how are they feeling now, and many people really miss their country and want to return to Ukraine, but it's really important that they don't know whether they will have accessible accommodation, whether they will have services. We met families who are not sure what kind of education their children will be able to have. And so one of the things that seemed to be really incredibly important to the people is the building of person-centered services here in Ukraine, so that people can come back and live independently in their communities with support surrounding them. And as you mentioned, also the possibility to work, to have employment, and also I think particularly for families with children with disabilities, that their children have meaningful activities, so that as well family members can participate in the labour market. So anyway, I'm here mainly though to listen so that we can shape our ideas for the future. Thank you, Elena.
Thank you so much.
I would like to continue our today's conversation and to introduce another woman today. I would like to emphasize that women can build successful careers, they can be successful, they can make decisions, and they can support others in making changes to their lives, not only to their lives but also to Ukraine. Tatiana Lomakina, the Commissioner of the President of Ukraine on removal of barriers. Ms. Tatiana, please. Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank this organization, the League of the Strong, for gathering us around this very important subject today, because the role of the civil society is extremely important, so that in front of the people who make decisions, who are representatives of the government, so that we actualize the most sensitive matters. And I would like to thank the Minister of Social Policy that regardless of your huge workload, you're with us today and you share the ideas you promote as the minister along with all of your ministry. I would like to thank Ms. Catherine, who came here today and who said that during planning of the measures for years 23-24, we already started working on all those issues of facilitating of communication between the people who make decisions on the level of local governance and central government. We are able to build all those services together, and thank you for focusing our attention on the European Act for Accessibility. And I want to say that this plan that we were developing in cooperation with civil organizations and bodies of central government and local governances, we set a task for the country to start this movement towards removal of barriers and accessibility of goods and services. And we would like to also ask for your expertise, ask your experts to give us advice so we do it in a correct way at once, because as you mentioned, we will be rebuilding Ukraine and we have to lay the fundamentals which help us create services, spaces, information in a way they're convenient for the people. And as to our plans, on the matters which Ms. Darina mentioned about, I would like to say that our communication with the international partners proved that the countries were transferring from barriers in space to removal of those barriers within 30, 40 or 50 years. So we have to be conscious that tomorrow not any apartment block will have the stairs disappear. It will be a way that we're just stepping on, we're just initiating, and it's important that Ukraine already approved the new construction standards and implemented the European standards for construction in Ukraine. And but are they sufficient? We had a conversation yesterday with the representatives of military administrations of all regions. We were talking about new standards that right now we have to lay fundamentals for future construction, for rebuilding of services and spaces. And when you talk with them, I was making a presentation, I was mentioning the mistakes we were making during the evacuation when we were building those model towns. They understand, but when the people start doing something, they face the problem that maybe there is a compromise, maybe there are 3 steps, and then everything goes without barriers because it's not so convenient that way. So we have to bring up all those issues, we have to mention them, we have to remind that there is no space for compromise. If I'm in a wheelchair, I cannot step on those 3 steps and use the rest of the non-barrier free space. So all those things, they require very honest conversation and explanation. Because what country feels now, what is important for us, for every person, if we plan the evacuation, we have to help all the people to get out of the areas of active warfare, elderly, fathers and mothers who educate multiple children, people with disabilities, everybody. But that requires certain flexibility, different measures for evacuation, coordination more active than between the military civil administration and say state emergency service. And what we're hearing today, that the situation when those model towns are built with infringement of the accessibility standards is it's the issue we won't be able to solve by ourselves in Ukraine, because we receive a number of those module towns from our international partners, because they arrive to us without accessible showers, accessible bathrooms, accessible passageways. And even if we make them accessible, people will not be able to move inside of those buildings. And this is where we're asking your organization, Catherine, to bring up that subject, because if we're in the middle of Europe, we're facing this terrible war and we're going through all those tribulations, and the European countries supply those model towns to us, it means that they did not take into account those accessibility standards. And our experience should become an experience for all of our Western partners to demonstrate the practice we're having here now. And talking about the rebuilding, I would like to say that together with Ms. Oksana and Mr. Vitaly, we were all present at the Council of Barriers Free Space on the 15th of February, where the Ministry of Infrastructure presented the new resolution of our government within the Cabinet of Ministers. It was about the fact that everything that will be rebuilt should be rebuilt in compliance with European norms and standards. That's our responsibility already. We have to create services and procure goods so that all people could use them, taking into account the needs for the people with disabilities. And we have information, we have to make the produce the information in a way that it can be perceived by everybody, but even by people who have limitations in terms of their perception. And if we have, for example, standards for construction, then for goods, information and services, it's our task to create those standards which would be synchronized with the European standards, to teach everybody to create services and information in a way it's accessible to everybody. It's our huge task, and I think that the non-governmental organizations should play a huge role in that, because people live in communities. At the level of the government, we may introduce the standard, but make it alive on the level of community. We have to communicate with the local councils, local governments, and that's the level we should talk through with everybody and among ourselves. Again, getting back to the experience of other countries, implementation of their reforms. I was asking in Belgium when they were undertaking a reform on psychological health, they were taking that resolution on the level of central government. They also have decentralization, and I was asking how it worked on the level of local governments, and they said that the main thing is the communication, disclosure of that subject, explanation why it's important, in engagement of people from those communities, so they become the voice of those reforms. And this is when all that important cooperation started. Thank you, thank you. I would like to introduce Vitaly. Thank you for passing the microphone. It's my pleasure to introduce the chairman of the Group for Active Rehabilitation, Vitaly Pcholkin. Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to express my opinion, for all the great job that you've done, for that support that allowed us last year to save, honestly, to save a lot of people with disabilities. That's invaluable support that you provided from European Disabilities Forum. Thank you very much. In context of rebuilding, all the important subjects were already mentioned, and they are understood to the state, which was not so understood so well before. But fortunately today the issue of people with disabilities, with limitation of perceptions, they are visible to everybody, and everybody understands that those are the problems that we will live with for years to come, because we see daily that the number of people who get injured due to explosions, the consequences of the war, I mean both military and civil. We know how vile our enemy is. They destroy the civil infrastructure, so the number of such people grows exponentially. And at the same time, I was looking at the statistics of the traffic catastrophes, and the level of injuries is quite high there too. And additionally to all those new challenges we have, there are all challenges that did not disappear. So the main tasks that all of us will have, we want to emphasize that every person in Ukraine should realize their responsibility for how they can go further, because it's not the Minister of Social Policies who provides the services in the coffee shop, it's the owner of the coffee shop. And each of us, we have to understand, we have to take a broad view, because people may come and they may ask, why I paid with my health, and now I cannot drink a cup of coffee with my wife in this coffee shop. So that's gonna be the question which will become very hot. So in context of removal of barriers, it's control over the compliance with the legislation, improvement of legislation, and raising awareness, because we see that even the designers, the developers, the constructors understanding that what they do it in a professional way, but they don't understand all the specificities of practical application. It's yet another question we have to study. The needs of the people with disabilities, because even us, me and Dolana, having the same spinal injury, we have different needs. My injury is higher and I have individual needs. I'm dependent on external support. We were checking in the hotel, and for example, the bed there was 10 centimeters higher than I could get on. So here is where I'm dependent on someone else's support. So taking this context of provision with assistive measures, this individual approach is very important, because one person may get a basic wheelchair and it might not be sufficient for another person. They should be provided with a broader number of assistive devices. Here we're not even talking about the persons with some severe disabilities that the government, the state was considering as those who are immobilized, but a person who is conscious cannot be considered immobilized. Maybe it's just the matter of non-availability of proper assistant devices or proper picking of the personal assistant. And when we understand that there should be no proper or complete rehabilitation, we still have to be able to provide these people with jobs. And we know there are examples throughout the world that such people can get employed. Such people may have more interest in life, and we see, for example, now we see the military, and it's a sufficient number of such military with crutches, but the level of their disabilities, they say that they will live the rest of their lives using the lung ventilation devices, but no one knows when they would be checked out of the hospital, because there are no opportunities for them to get back home, to get proper support at home. And those are the questions we have to work with. We talk about the motivation for the military a lot. We understand that we don't have other chance other than fighting, other than struggle, but we know that many of our military, they go to the war understanding that they may die, but they don't understand that they may become disabled, and understanding of the fact that when they come back here with a certain disability, they still have a chance for decent, high quality life. That will be a very serious motivation for improvement of our resilience as a country. So development of the adequate services and rehabilitation, they should be switched to the level when we stop giving vain hopes. We have to start speaking honestly that there are these types of disabilities that cannot be cured. until now. Yes, all of us, we want that someday those things can be cured, but we have to understand that there are injuries with which people will have to learn to live. And there is a complex of infrastructure measures, social measures that will allow people live decent lives regardless of any injuries. So I appreciate all the work everybody does in this area, and the experience of our international partners will be very important in this area, and I hope you will be able to make use of our experience. Thank you, Mr. Vitali. Ms. Tatiana mentioned that we will have to use the experience of other countries, and other countries were going that way for 30, 40, 50 years. So we have to take their best practices to maybe to skip through some mistakes and to make everything for us, for our country, for our people in an expedited way. I have an opportunity to let our journalists ask questions from our guests. So who is going to be the first? Thank you, Svetlana Tkachuk, Ukrinform. I have a couple of questions to you. Well, I think that everybody may answer them. My first question is statistical. Is there a way to count a number of people with disabilities in Ukraine, and those people with disabilities who left abroad? So you mean the internally disabled and those who left abroad? Well, look, we have the statistics for those who left abroad and those who were internally displaced inside Ukraine, but we don't segregate people with disabilities from the others, so I cannot give you the exact number of those. For example, I just know that people with families who were living abroad, there was a lot of barriers for the people with disabilities who were living abroad, and those who were single or were staying in the specialized facilities, they mostly remained in Ukraine because our partners were not able to provide them with all the services necessary. So unfortunately, we don't have these extensive statistics. Thank you for your answer. And my question will be related maybe to the speech of Mr. Vitali. In what way during the rebuilding Ukraine will be able to provide, to ensure the needs of all the people with disabilities? Because like Vitali mentioned, as Vitali mentioned, people with the same type of injury, they may have different needs. How that may be ensured, maybe experience of some countries may help us in this regard. Well, if I may answer, in fact, we have to transform the approaches to all types of services we provide now. The first response in this regard may be research study of the people according to the International Qualification of Function. And this is the new questionnaire that we actively implement in our lives everywhere, including in the Ministry of Health, which will allow us to approach every person in more detail, to understand their needs with the account of their functioning abilities, not like some diagnosis. This diagnosis doesn't matter anymore during our times because, for example, the groups of disability we have, the people with diabetes and people driving a wheelchair, they fall under the same category in this regard, but their needs are absolutely different. There is no sense for retaining those grades, those categories, and we had a number of meetings with our Prime Minister to transform the approaches to disability, to create the packages of aid with account of this international qualification for functioning, so that if people are in the wheelchair, they should have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 those needs included in their package, and those with diabetes, they should have their package on needs, so they should not fall under the same category, and we don't spread this, say, financial aid in a thin layer, because in fact we don't get anything from that. We have to go through rehabilitation. It should be timely and high quality. We have to bring people back on their feet the soonest possible, and then they should be accompanied during their employment, and we should consider financial aid in cases where people lose their functioning abilities to the extent that they cannot function properly, to be included in the society. Well, my last question will be not about the disabilities, but maybe about the change of perception of image of people with disabilities. Well, talking about media during coverage of that matter of people with disabilities, what do you see in future? What should we do to transform the perception of this image? Well, I would like to pass the microphone to Vitaly Pcholkin. I could have responded if I were a speaker. Thank you for your question. Actually, for the media, there is a lot of information, there is a lot of prepared materials, a lot of trainings are going on, because media are a backbone for creating the image, for understanding of needs of people with disabilities. So we have to preserve those balances, because sometimes there is some extreme heroization, or there is a lot of description of sufferings and desperation. Well, obviously there are factors on both sides, but what we see in the media is black and white, but life is really colorful, and people with disabilities, they have a lot of different things in their lives, and the balanced coverage would be extremely important in creation the proper perception of the image of people with disabilities. Another thing is that media, in their aspiration to support the military, for example, they try to cover it in a way that, for example, I've seen an article recently, a person with a spinal injury, serious spinal injury, who will not be rehabilitated to the full extent 100%, but it's a direct speech: I'm an airborne, I will make it, and until and unless I get back on my feet. Well, that quote is being supported, but I think that it should be transformed in a different way, that regardless of the fact that that person is an airborne, no one puts it under doubt, but we have to take life realistically, and this position will be more useful. So just we have to retain adequacy. This is what's important. If I may, I would like to add a couple of words. Just yesterday we were discussing it with the regions, how to change, or how the attitude should change to the attitude to all the people whose functioning is impaired. There are people who were in the blind zone, for example, the people with some cognitive impairments or movement impairments. They make people such that they could address the government for support, they could get more high quality lives. But talking about the communities of the people whose function is impaired, people with disabilities, if we want those people to feel equal, we have to make a step forward, a step for acceptance, to accept everybody as they are. We have to say that people with disabilities are not those who require permanent care, but they are regular people who drink their coffees in the morning. they move around their life spaces or their life trajectories. Someone goes to work, someone brings their kids to the kindergartens. Many people with disabilities are involved in volunteer activities. All those people should be perceived as equal. But first of all, we should accept them. And it's an important work that everybody has to do. Thank you, Ms. Titana. I would like to say that the understanding of the notion of the standard, it's non-standard because all the human variety is the standard now. We are one society. We don't have to segregate one people from the others. We have to remember that people with disabilities can bring up the subjects not only of people with disabilities. And if I made the last question, Yulia Avakumova, Ukrinform, my colleague asked, but I would like to ask a couple of details from Ms. Oksana. My colleague was interested about the number of people with disabilities who left, but can you name the number of people with disabilities in Ukraine? How much of them have limited mobility in context of the rebuilding? How many people require this accessibility standard? Well, look, this is contemplated by the law in effect. There are groups 1 to 4 of disability. The people of the first group of disability, they need some external, they may need assistance, just like the people with the second group of disability, because people who are above 80 years old who have no disabilities, they may have some cognitive impairment, and they may be entitled to someone else's assistance and care. But in general, we have 2.6 million people with disabilities. The largest group is third group is 1.5 million, and this is very, very rough statistics which does not demonstrate those specifics we were discussing just now, we've been discussing. So we have to switch to another system of categorization with the count of needs, and when we implement this MQF standard on all levels, taking into account all the smaller needs, for example, people driving a wheelchairs, that they should be able to buy a ticket for railway, for example, for the specific car in the railway. And when we take into account all of their needs, the scale of the services will be quite different. We update all of our digital instruments. For the time being, we unfortunately don't have this centralized system for assignment of the status of disability, and they move to different social structures like pension fund, the Department for Social Protection. And just this morning we've been talking during our morning briefing that we should create a joint register. Unfortunately, we have not created it yet, but we're working on it. And just a small comment, those communities which started with the aspiration to respond to those needs, they understood that it improved the life of all the members of that community, because everybody feels it more comfortable. But if we're talking about the demand is much broader than for the people with disabilities. But if we respond to those needs, we will make our world better.
I don't want to comment on the issue of the number of people with disabilities, because I think the state authorities here have detailed information, but we know that it was very difficult for the governments in other countries to count the number of people with disabilities arriving, because people came very fast and they were not identified for their needs when they arrived. But I want to comment on one issue related to reconstruction. If you have 2 million or 2.7 million people with disabilities in Ukraine, the full population of Ukraine will benefit from an accessible reconstruction. So I think that in all of our cities that have developed accessibility, we can thank disability activists that our cities become easier to live in. When the museum is accessible, the school is accessible, the coffee shop is accessible. It's done sometimes to make it accessible for people with disabilities, but you see older people, people with a pushchair and children, people carrying heavy shopping or luggage at the airport. We all benefit. So the more progress it's made now in the name of making it accessible for people injured in the war or other people with disabilities, but the whole population in the end benefit. Many companies that made an accessible website for buying shopping, afterwards they only use the accessible website because everyone finds it easier to use. The language is simpler, the clicks are less. We have the experience of public consultation where one is made for the general population and one is made as the accessible consultation for people with disabilities. Everyone uses the accessible one because it's made in a more user-friendly way which benefits everyone. So even if the number of people might feel small sometimes, everyone will benefit. Thanks.
Дякую, Дар'я. І
Thank you, Daria. And let's proceed to our next step. I'm giving just a small comment. Everybody already understood that when we talk about our project, Rebuild Ukraine Inclusion, first of all, it's about infrastructural and architectural accessibility, but it doesn't end there, because to provide the proper way of life for the people with disabilities, people who live with disabilities for a long time, they should be provided with rehabilitation services, social services, and we have to make sure that their disability doesn't influence on their employment. So within our project we said that thus that people with disabilities can live in Ukraine on par with other people who don't have disabilities. Thank you. And of course we have to identify what's needed for every single person. So on this optimistic note, I would like to summarize. I would like to express the words of appreciation for the new projects, new ideas, new movements to towards transformation of Ukraine, and I'm sure that in coordination with government and our international partners and civil sector, we will be able to change the lives of Ukrainians for better, not only on paper, but we will be able to change their very specific lives. And to wrap up our event, we would like to sign the memorandum between the European Disabilities Forum and our Ministry for Social Policies. So please bring the table so Ms. Oksana and Ms. Catherine can sign the memorandum. Well, just like I mentioned in the beginning, we want to take the best practices existing in the world, in Ukraine, to make the way around this long way that many countries have had to go through, so that we can implement the best European norms and standards in view of our European integration. So it will be my pleasure to announce that us, in cooperation with European Disabilities Forum, we signed the memorandum for further cooperation, and they support our legislative initiatives, our projects. We will receive from them all the technical and legislative support that will allow us to become more accessible, more inclusive, and to ensure the rights of all of our citizens in a proper way. I wanted to prepare a spot for signing memorandum for you. is that trilateral agreement. Ms. Oksana says that national service is involved as the third party in this process. Well, I want to thank all of our speakers, all of our guests, our journalists for your questions, the spectators who were watching us. Thank you. Well, see you next time, and we have a lot of work to be done ahead. Дякую вам. Дякую.
Maybe photo?
Можете допомогти? Я згадала, що